It often feels like we're peering through a fog when it comes to our politicians. You know, are their decisions driven by what's best for us, or is there something else going on behind the scenes?
Hmm.
That fundamental question of trust and accountability, it's really at the heart of any democracy.
And it's exactly that question we're digging into today. We have some, well, fascinating research looking at a real-world situation that unfolded in Brazil starting back in 2003.
Brazil, okay.
Yeah, the federal government there began this program of randomly auditing how municipalities were using federal funds.
Randomly. Okay, so not like targeting places they already suspected.
Precisely. That random element is absolutely key for understanding what happened next. Because here's where it gets really interesting. The findings of these audits, they weren't kept under wraps. They were made public, posted online, and actively shared with the media.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Public information about potential corruption.
Mm.
Or, I guess, the lack of it sometimes.
Ex-
So the big question is, what happened when this information landed in the public sphere? How did it affect the politicians, the incumbents who were in power when these audits took place?
Exactly. Did voters actually hold potentially corrupt politicians accountable at the ballot box? And, what role did the local news play in all of this?
Right.
This study gives us a really unique opportunity to see the real-world effects of transparency in action, basically thanks to this randomized audit program.
It's like a direct look into whether voters can actually make informed choices and, well, influence who governs them when they have solid information. So what makes this study so valuable for understanding democracy itself?
Well, as we've sort of touched on, the ability of citizens to hold their elected officials accountable it's a cornerstone of a well-functioning democracy.
Which sounds straightforward on the surface.
Mm.
If someone's doing a bad job or is being dishonest, we vote them out.
Simple, right? Well, not quite. That really assumes voters have access to clear, reliable information to assess their politicians' performance accurately.
And that's often where things get tricky, isn't it? Getting hold of trustworthy, unbiased information isn't always easy. Plus, as we know, political narratives can be twisted and spread incredibly quickly.
Absolutely. And that's precisely why this situation in Brazil is so insightful. Usually it's incredibly hard to isolate the impact of just information on elections because who gets what information isn't random at all. It's influenced by so many other factors.
Okay, so let's get into the details of this anti-corruption program in Brazil. 2003, the federal government starts these random audits of municipalities. What exactly were they looking for?
So the program, it was run by the Controladoria Geral da União, the CGU. It focused on how municipalities were spending federal funds that had been allocated to them.
Okay.
The main goals were basically twofold: discourage the misuse of public funds and also encourage citizens to be more involved in monitoring public spending.
So they weren't just looking at, like, minor paperwork issues or something.
No. The audits aimed to uncover significant irregularities in how these federal funds were being used. And to ensure openness, summaries of the key findings were posted online and proactively shared with the news media.
That sounds like a pretty bold move by the government back then. How big was this program? How many places actually got audited?
Well, it started relatively small, just one municipality per state, but it expanded quickly.
Right.
The selections were made monthly alongside the national lotteries, and they started picking 50 to 60 municipalities at a time. The focus was generally on municipalities with fewer than 450,000 residents.
Okay, so smaller places mostly.
Yeah, which actually accounts for about 92% of all municipalities in Brazil. So a very wide reach.
Wow. And to make sure the selection was fair, who was involved in that process? How did they ensure transparency there?
Well, to really emphasize the transparency, representatives from the press, political parties, and even organizations from civil society were invited to actually witness the lottery selections.
You really can't get much more transparent than that. So once a municipality was chosen, what did the auditors actually do on the ground?
Teams of around 10 to 15 auditors from the CGU would go to the municipality. They'd carefully examine financial records, they'd inspect public works projects, check the delivery of public services, and importantly, they also met with local residents and council members to get direct feedback and hear any concerns about potential problems.
That sounds like a pretty thorough investigation. And these auditors, were they independent experts or politically appointed?
Good question. No, they were hired through a competitive public examination process. They underwent extensive training. They were also well paid, which, helps reduce the temptation for corruption.
Right.
And each team had a supervisor overseeing their work.
Okay, so after about 10 days of investigation, what happened to all the information they gathered? Where did it go?
A detailed report outlining all the irregularities found was submitted to the CGU's main office. These reports were then officially sent to various bodies, the Tribunal de Cuentas de Unión, or TCU, public prosecutors, and the local municipal council.
Okay.
And crucially, as we said, a summary of the main findings was also made publicly available online and shared with major news outlets.
So the information was definitely out there. But, I mean, did it actually reach the average voter? Did people know about it?
That's the crucial question, right? While we don't have individual survey data for everyone who read an audit report, there's strong anecdotal evidence suggesting the information did reach the public and was used in political campaigns.
Tell us more. What did the local news say? What kind of stories came out?
For instance, the Diario de Pará newspaper reported how the CGU findings were heavily used in political campaigns, and not just by the opposition, but also by incumbents who received positive reports.
Interesting. Both ways.
Yeah. They mentioned the small city of Vicosa in Alagoas, where the mayor narrowly lost his re-election bid after significant corruption findings were publicized. His opponent apparently used pamphlets and even large screens in the town center to display the audit report.
Wow.
The losing mayor himself actually blamed the CGU for his defeat.
Ouch. That's a pretty direct consequence. Any other examples of this playing out politically?
Yes. The Folha de Espalo newspaper quoted the mayor of Itagimirim in Bahia, who, just before the elections, was openly worrying that the opposition would exploit the audit information against him. And in Taparoa, also in Bahia, Agencia Folha reported that the public was genuinely shocked by the revelations of fraud uncovered in their municipality. A local legislator even stated that the information really took the community by surprise.
So it wasn't just dry government documents gathering dust. This was making headlines and actually influencing local political conversations. But how did this information spread, especially in smaller towns where maybe newspaper circulation isn't huge?
That's where local radio becomes really, really important. In Brazil, especially in smaller municipalities, maybe with lower average levels of education, newspapers often aren't the main source of local news. Readership is quite low compared to many other countries with similar income levels.
Right. So if people weren't reading papers, how are they getting their local political news?
Local AM radio stations, they've really become the central way people in these areas get local political information, especially since Brazil's return to democracy in the 1980s. While national television has a wider reach, only a small percentage of municipalities, maybe 8%, had their own local TV broadcasts back then. But compare that to about 34% with local AM radio stations.
That's a big difference. Radio is often much more deeply connected to the local community anyway.
Exactly. And these aren't just stations playing music. Many have call-in talk shows where people can voice their concerns about local issues, public services, and even discuss corruption scandals.
Right.
Local radio hosts often become quite influential figures, sort of acting as a link between the community and their politicians.
So radio was likely a key channel for spreading this audit information. Now, how did the researchers actually define and measure corruption based on these audit reports? That can be a tricky thing to quantify, right?
Yeah.
Distinguishing real corruption from just mistakes.
That's a really important point about the methodology, yeah. The researchers carefully read through the audit reports, which detailed any irregularities found. They then categorized these irregularities into two main groups: those that strongly suggested corruption and those that seemed to be more about, well, poor administrative practices or incompetence.
Okay, so making that distinction, what kind of things were classified as actual corruption then?
They focused on irregularities that indicated fraud in procurements, things like skipping the public bidding process altogether, or clear evidence of fake bids being submitted. They also looked for the misuse or diversion of public funds, like spending without proof of purchase, or direct evidence of funds being used improperly for personal gain. And finally, they identified cases of significant over-invoicing for goods or services bought by the municipality.
Can you give us a specific example from the audits? What did one of these corruption instances look like in practice?
Absolutely. So in San Francisco do Conde, in Bahia, auditors found a road construction project where the receipts added up to 5 times the estimated cost.
5 times?
Yeah. And the company hired had basically no construction experience and just subcontracted the work. Further investigation showed the firm had given an apartment to the mayor and his family.
Oh, wow.
So that was classified as over-invoicing with pretty clear signs of corruption, kickbacks.
Yeah, pretty clear evidence there. What about the other categories, like diversion of funds?
Well, in Capelinha, Minas Gerais, The municipality received money for a health program, but then used fake receipts to account for a large portion of it. There was no evidence the medical goods were ever actually bought. That was categorized as diversion of public funds.
Okay.
And in Cacale, Bahia, the bidding process for building a sports complex was apparently rigged with specific requirements that only one particular firm could meet. And that firm later found to have provided kickbacks to the mayor. That fell under illegal procurement practices.
So it wasn't just counting any problem, but specifically identifying those strongly linked to potential corruption. How did they then use this information to analyze what happened in the elections?
So for each municipality, they counted the number of these specific corruption-related irregularities to create a quantitative measure of corruption. Then, to specifically look at re-election chances, they focused the analysis on mayors who were serving their first term and were eligible to run again in the upcoming 2004 elections. This gave them a sample of 373 municipalities to analyze the impact of this pre-election audit information on those incumbents.
And what were the initial overall findings? Did these audits and the public release of information immediately lead to, a wave of incumbents losing their jobs?
Interestingly, the initial broad finding was that, on average, the audits and the release of information didn't seem to have a statistically significant impact on whether incumbent mayors were reelected.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, I mean, the re-election rates were slightly lower in municipalities audited before the election compared to those audited after, but the difference wasn't large enough to be statistically significant across the whole sample.
Huh.
They found similarly small, sort of minimal effects on vote shares and the margin of victory for mayors who did run for re-election.
You'd think if information about potential corruption came out right before an election, voters would react strongly. Why no clear average effect then?
Well, the researchers strongly suspected that this lack of a clear average effect was basically hiding a more complex picture. The amount of corruption revealed in the audits varied quite significantly from place to place. And as we discussed, the role of local media in actually getting that information out to voters also likely played a really big part.
Okay, so the details matter. What happened when they started looking not just if an audit happened, but at the level of corruption that was uncovered?
This is where it gets really interesting and the picture becomes much clearer. When they took into account the level of corruption revealed in those pre-election audits, the impact became quite significant.
How so?
They found this striking trend in municipalities audited before the election. The more corruption violations that were found, the lower the re-election rate of the incumbent mayor. A clear downward slope. And this was very different from what they saw in municipalities audited after the election. In those cases, the re-election rates stayed relatively consistent regardless of the level of corruption eventually uncovered in the audit.
So if voters knew about the corruption before they went to the polls, it had a real effect. But if the information only came out after the election was over, well, it obviously couldn't change the outcome of that specific election. That makes sense.
Exactly.
What were the actual numbers? How big was this effect? Can you quantify it?
Yeah, the drop-off was pretty stark. In pre-election audits where no corruption was found, re-election rates were relatively high, hovering around 53%. But as the number of violations increased, say, up to 3 violations, the re-election rate plummeted significantly, down to around 20%.
Wow, from 53 down to 20. That's a dramatic difference.
Exactly.
So voters weren't ignoring this information at all.
Not at all. The data really indicates they were paying attention and, well, updating their beliefs. The researchers also used regression analysis to quantify this more formally. While simple linear models didn't show a significant negative impact across the board.
Right, suggesting it wasn't just a straight line down.
Exactly. More advanced models, like quadratic or semi-parametric ones, revealed a much more complex picture, showing a significant negative impact specifically from disclosing extensive corruption.
Okay.
For instance, having 2 corruption violations revealed before the election reduced a mayor's chance of re-election by about 25 percentage points compared to having only 1 violation revealed.
25 points. That's huge electorally.
It is. And the effect was even larger with 3 violations. They also found that if they excluded a few extreme outliers, municipalities with more than 5 violations, the statistical significance actually strengthened, and the estimated negative impact per violation roughly doubled in their preferred models.
So a very robust finding then. Now, what about the possibility that the audit process itself might have been biased somehow? Could auditors have been influenced or maybe targeted certain mayors?
That's a crucial question to consider always. Could there be manipulation? The researchers did several checks to see if this was plausible.
Yeah.
They found it pretty unlikely that the audit process was systematically manipulated. Remember, the auditors were hired competitively, well-paid, no reported bribery incidents.
Okay.
Also, importantly, the average levels of corruption found were statistically similar in both the pre-election and post-election audit groups. That suggests there wasn't a systematic bias in when audits with high or low findings occurred relative to the election.
That comparison group is key.
It is. They also looked at political factors like, was the mayor affiliated with the state governor or the president? Did they have large campaign donations? They found no evidence that these things influenced whether a municipality got a tougher or easier audit. The timing of the audit, pre or post-election, was the driving factor in the electoral results, not these other political characteristics.
So it really seems the information disclosure tied to the timing was the key factor, not some underlying bias in who got audited or what was found. Okay, let's circle back to the role of local media, especially radio. You mentioned it was likely a really important link in getting this information to voters. What did the data show specifically about radio's impact?
Right. The results strongly suggest that local radio played a critical role in amplifying the impact of these audit findings. The negative effect of revealing corruption on an incumbent's re-election chances was significantly stronger in municipalities that actually had local radio stations.
How much stronger? Can you give us some specific numbers on that interaction?
Yeah, it's quite striking. In municipalities with at least one local radio station where, say, 3 corruption violations were reported before the election, the likelihood of the mayor's re-election decreased by about 16 percentage points compared to similar municipalities audited after the election.
Okay, 16 points down with radio.
But in comparable municipalities without a local radio station, the decrease linked to those same 3 violations was only about 3.7 percentage points.
Wow, that's a huge difference. 16 versus less than 4. So radio wasn't just passively reporting the news, it was actively increasing the electoral consequences of the audit findings.
Exactly. It seems to have made the information much more salient and impactful for voters. And interestingly, it wasn't just about punishing the corrupt.
Oh.
The data also showed that in municipalities with local radio where the pre-election audit found no corruption, the audit actually increased the likelihood of the mayor being re-elected by a significant margin, around 17 percentage points.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So radio acted as both a watchdog exposing corruption and a platform for good governance, or at least clean audits, to be recognized and rewarded.
Precisely. It amplified the signal in both directions, negative for corruption, positive for a clean slate.
But hang on, could the presence of a radio station just be linked to other factors that influence election outcomes? You know, maybe towns of the radio stations are just different in other ways, more educated, bigger, wealthier.
That's a very valid point, absolutely. The presence of a radio station wasn't randomly assigned like the audits were, so the researchers had to address this potential confounding issue.
How do they do that?
They included various control variables in their statistical models, things like municipal education levels, population size, income inequality. They looked at how these factors interacted with the audit results and radio presence.
What did they find? Did the radio effect disappear?
No, even after accounting for these potential influences, the strong, significant combined effect, the triple interaction of a pre-election audit, high levels of corruption, and the presence of local radio remained robust.
So it wasn't just that radio towns were different.
It appears not solely that, no. They even used an alternative measure, the percentage of households owning radios in the municipality, and found similar results. Higher radio ownership correlated with a greater negative impact of disclosed corruption on re-election.
And what about other media, newspapers, TV?
Interestingly, they didn't find significant similar differential effects based on whether there were local newspapers or based on television ownership levels. This really seems to reinforce the unique and central role of local radio in disseminating this kind of information effectively in this specific context, these smaller Brazilian municipalities at that time.
So the picture that emerges is really quite clear then. The public release of audit information in Brazil definitely had a real measurable impact on electoral accountability. Voters used the information.
Yes, they did.
And local radio was a key factor, maybe the key factor, in making sure that information reached voters and actually influenced their decisions at the ballot box.
That's the main conclusion, yes. Voters did seem to punish corrupt incumbents when they had reliable information pointing to that corruption. And local radio played a vital role in disseminating those audit findings effectively to the electorate. amplifying the consequences.
It's a really insightful finding, isn't it, that transparency, especially when it's effectively communicated by accessible local media, can truly empower voters and, well, help hold politicians accountable.
Absolutely.
So thinking beyond this specific study, what are the wider implications here? Can we learn from this experience in other democracies facing similar challenges with corruption and accountability? And maybe what role can local media play or should play in promoting accountability in our own communities today? It certainly makes you think about the power of information and, frankly, the essential role of a free and accessible press, even, or perhaps especially, at the local level.